Katerina Jaka watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jaka saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. I'm Chris Driscoll, and along with me is Rainer Shea. Hello, Rainer. How are you?
Oh, we were just talking about the media consequences of the coronavirus. I want to reiterate what I just observed. Firstly, at least I have the competence to aim my camera at eye level. Initially, after all these late night comedians were forced to do YouTube versions of their shows, their teams were so inexperienced that their cameras were pointing upwards, and it looked really awkward, really unflattering.
Like up the nose, huh?
Because that's how, yeah. And a lot of cringe resulted from the pandemic. Maybe one of the worst consequences of the pandemic was this cringe that started to plague YouTube when Trevor Noah, Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, they all started. They had to force themselves into this format that they were not familiar with, and I think Seth Meyers actually started pausing as a reflex after each joke because he had the muscle memory of having the audience clap or laugh. But no one's there to clap or laugh. You're in your room, not in the studio.
Yeah, that's I guess that's a comedic or humorous side effect of COVID-19. I want to point out, now that you've raised this, that I have my camera pointed at me at like that direction because that's the only place here I've got to clip it. It's on top of my monitor, and my monitor's that tall, and that's what I get. So, but I guess I could go buy like a one of them little tripods, but then every time I move my little table, I've got this table that I slide in under my chair to do my computer, and if I put it on a tripod, it'd be tipping over and all kinds of, it would be even more of a mess. But anyway, on with the show, Rainer Shea. So that's all you're going to tell us about how you doing.
I just had a thought.
Yeah.
To elaborate, well, I feel very happy these days.
Good.
I feel like I figured a lot of things out.
Wow. That's great to hear. You've come to a revelation point in your life. Now,
Yes.
what's next?
2020 was the worst year of my life, and that's saying a lot, but it wasn't because of the pandemic. It was because of anxieties that I kept having about the future of my career. It was because of this toxic social media environment that was passing judgment on me for supposedly objectionable statements that I had made at certain points. And I've been looking at these incidents where Minecraft YouTubers, gaming YouTubers, people like that, they're constantly being canceled on Twitter.
Yeah.
Like denounced by a bunch of people on Twitter, but pretty much all of the time, unless it's somebody who's actually done something horrifying, racist, pedophilic, most of the time in those instances, it's BS that these grandstanders are trying to spin into something that should be taken seriously.
Right.
It's such ridiculousness. And I did not know this at the time, so I took everything, all of this feedback, this BS feedback that was being directed towards me, totally seriously. I had the mentality that if just one person got influenced against me because of these narratives that were being thrown against me, like people exploiting supposedly objectionable things I'd said in the past. If just one person was influenced against me and was inclined not to follow my work because of this, I might as well have failed as a movement leader. I might as well have done all this work for nothing. That was how much I cared about what all these nobodies thought of me.
Right.
And it was really delusional and unhealthy thinking. I was not basing the way I viewed myself and the world around reality. It was deeply unhealthy, and I did things to myself that I have taken a long time to forgive myself for.
Life is a journey.
But at a certain point, things changed. Things changed about how my mind works.
Yeah. Well, that is an important revelation. And it just so happens, coincidentally, that one of our topics tonight is a new book by Dan Kovalik. He's one of my favorite authors. He's a lawyer, and he's a labor lawyer in Pittsburgh. And he talks about, in this new book, it's called Cancel This Book. And he talks about cancel culture and the liberal the direction that liberalism has gone. I'll get into it later on. I think people will want to run out and buy this book after hearing about this. But yeah, we'll get into that. First on the list, however, is an article from the Workers' World Party, their publication, Workers, I think it's called, or something like that. It's at workers.org. That's easy enough to remember, workers.org. And this article is by G. Dunkel. It appeared on May 11th, and it's titled Evictions, Hunger, Wage Theft, Pandemic Triple Threat to Workers. And it's a pretty good article. I want to recommend it to people. We'll have the link for it down below. It goes into, well, it says estimates on the amount of back rent currently owed range from, let's see, 8.4 billion owed by 1.4 million households from the Federal Reserve of Philadelphia to 24.4 billion owed by 14.4 million households from the US Census Bureau to 52.6 billion owed by 9.4 million households from Moody's Analytics. Hard to say, they're saying here, hard to say which estimate is accurate, but all indicate that millions of people are at risk of losing their housing. There are a plethora of programs designed to protect tenants from eviction, from the ban to ensure public health placed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, just declared illegal by a district court judge, to a ban on evicting people from federally assisted public housing, as well as various bans on states, counties, and by states, counties, and cities. Both the CARES Act that Trump signed in March 2020 and the recent American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 provide funds for communities and states to create rental assistance programs to forestall evictions. Even with those programs, which have intricate application processes, exemptions, and income requirements, evictions still took place. Some evictions were unofficial, landlord thugs removing a tenant by force, and some took place legally when tenants could not vigorously defend their rights. Of course, when you're dealing with in some instances, people who don't have a real high education, and they've got to deal with all these complicated paperwork and shit just to get the protection. Apparently, a lot of people have already fallen through the cracks. Hunger, aka food insecurity. Because of the COVID virus pandemic, more than 42 million people in the US may experience food insecurity in 2021. Food insecurity is defined as a lack of consistent access to enough food for every person in a household to live an active, healthy life. This may be a temporary situation or last a long time. Food insecurity, one way to measure how many people cannot afford food, is especially prevalent in the US among children and older people. So, Rainer, thoughts?
Remember a few months ago when it was promised by headlines that the Biden plan would cut child poverty in half?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not going to be the case, because these programs are not built to sustain benefits to these impoverished families. It's a Band-Aid, and there was much made of the supposed radicalism of these measures that Biden was passing. I remember who was it? Larry Summers praised Biden for supposedly breaking drastically from austerity but this is very much in line with austerity. When you look at the bigger picture, when you look at the facts we've just mentioned about how all of these families are nonetheless going to be left behind, about how these programs aren't built to last in their benefits, and you put that up against all the money that's being spent on wars, and not just foreign wars but internal wars. Uh, I think we've also talked about how Biden has been dramatically increasing the funneling of military aid to police departments, about how Biden has been expanding the inhumane ICE detention centers along the border, about how Biden has been investing more in the militarized repressive state and in U.S. imperial holdings abroad than in the well-being of the country's people. Contrast this to China, which has actually experienced a notable decrease in the amount of poverty in this last year, whereas tens of millions of people in the capitalist world have been pushed into extreme poverty, not just in the US, but around the globe, pushed into extreme poverty because of the pandemic. I'm going to have to try to figure out the exact number of people who've become impoverished due to capitalism in this last year or so. I think it's at least 100 million, at least around 150 million. If the World Bank's estimate of the amount of newly impoverished people in 2020 is right, they made a prediction like in the fall of 2020 that would be the number.
And that's out of
anyway,
a total population.
There's a real.
That's out of a total population of 325
yeah.
million. So it's a pretty significant number.
No, like not. I mean, a global population.
Oh, global population.
Worldwide.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Is that it?
Yeah.
I didn't mean to cut you off. Next on the list, total war will be the outcome of America's fascist trajectory. Rainer Shea.
There are so many parallels between the United States and Germany in the lead up to the Third Reich. I mean, these observations have been made many times, but I think it's really interesting to look at the material motivations that went behind Hitler's drive towards war and conquest and mass extermination, and hold them up against the conditions that are arising in the era of climatic catastrophe. Hitler's wars for conquest were motivated by a desire for land, as Hitler called it, Lebensraum. He claimed that in order for the Aryan nation to properly develop, it had to attain a far greater amount of land than it already had. And according to the Nazi ideology, this had to entail the extermination of the Jews who supposedly stood in the way of this conquest plan, and in a similar genocide of the Slavs, of the Russians, so that the Germans could carry out a settler colonial project within Russia, explicitly, pretty clearly explicitly designed to parallel the U.S. settler colonial expansion project, which genocided the natives here. And in the 21st century, there's an increasing desire for a similar kind of Lebensraum, for an attainment of land that the fascists, the imperialists, feel that they lack. I mean, we see this certainly with Zionism, with its drive towards annexing all of this land. We see it in fascist India, where the Hindu nationalists have been colonizing Kashmir and carrying out genocide against the Muslims, who they claim that the Muslims stand in the way of India's interests. There's so many parallels that keep appearing between the modern fascists and the fascists back then. It's it's really scary, and it's clear that in the coming decades, the United States is going to reach a point similar to Germany in the lead up to World War II, where we're going to have a fascist extreme right government that's seeing the loss of territory in terms of sea level rise, in terms of the agricultural water systems collapses that are reducing the amount of habitable territory. Also, the droughts, heat waves, those are certainly going to reduce the amount of habitable land in the U.S. and most of the rest of the world. There's going to be this scarcity of resources and of land, and I fear that the fascists are going to use this as an excuse to drive forward with some similarly insane and impractical war, whether that war is against Venezuela or China or Cuba or Russia. And if that sounds implausible, if that sounds irrational, remember that the wars that the Nazis carried out were themselves very irrational, very impractical. They were based not in pragmatic reality, not in coherent strategy, but in delusion, the delusions of a very incompetent dictator, Adolf Hitler, who showed his military incompetence numerous times, and perhaps most of all with his decision to invade Russia, which was it was not going to result in victory for the Germans. It was going to result in collapse for the German Empire, like they had never seen before. And again, invading Russia was basically the whole deal of Hitler's colonization project. So that shows how irrational an empire in decline can become, with the extreme example of Nazi Germany, where they were waging war against their own people internally and against numerous other countries, even if this was essentially a suicide mission for the Germans. So it seems like eventually the United States is going to pull something similar, to do something so ridiculous, so inclined to cause mass destruction that they both doom themselves and perhaps kill hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah, it's frightening. And I would just point out that it's not inevitable. What you described certainly seems like the aims of the capitalist ruling class in the United States and the global capitalist ruling class, the imperialist hegemony around the world. That definitely seems like their aim. There's a lot of ethnic cleansing going on right here in America, as well as in more infamous places like the Zionist state in occupied Palestine, like the Ukrainian fascist state installed by Obama in 2014, is trying to do to the Russian speaking third of Ukraine, like they did to ethnic minorities and religious minorities in Yugoslavia when they determined in the early 1980s under the Reagan regime that they were going to disassemble, balkanize Yugoslavia. So yeah, there's already a long history of this by the American capitalist ruling class, by their state that they own and control, by the governments, the successive governments that come and go that they control always. But it is not inevitable. What'll it take to stop it? It'll take us stopping it. It'll take the global working class standing up against it. It'll take the American working class standing up against it. You know, there are some problems there. But on the other hand, I'm generally enthusiastic about the prospects for the future for our side in this struggle. This is a class struggle. This is a struggle by the ruling class and their minions against us, the working people of America, and against the working people of the world. So yeah, I agree 100%. Well done, by the way. Great article. And certainly it's something that is important to become more and more aware of and to start organizing against. Next on our list is Cancel Culture, the Bankruptcy of Liberalism, a CounterPunch article by Roger Harris. And this article, Cancel Culture and the Bankruptcy of Liberalism, starts out talking about Dan Kovalek, as I mentioned earlier on a few minutes past. Dan Kovalek is a professor of human rights law at the University of Pittsburgh, is an accomplished author of books skewering U.S. foreign policy on Venezuela, Russia, Iran, international human rights, and interference in elections abroad. His latest book, Cancel This Book, takes aim at the domestic progressive scene and its cancel culture aberration. Cancel culture is a form of intolerance that privileges form over substance and often substitutes a narrow identity politics to the detriment of the underlying issue of class. Kovalek argues that it is on the basis of class that the working people of all races can unite in common struggle. This element is conspicuously missing, quote unquote, conspicuously missing from the cancel culture discourse. Kovalek comments, the left of the political spectrum are excited about the new round of censorship being imposed by corporate giants such as Facebook and Twitter against Trump and his supporters. This type of censorship, he adds, will be mostly turned against the left, but sadly, many on the left in this country have not learned this lesson and are calling for measures that will ultimately lead to their own suppression. The biggest danger, Kovalek admits, is that people will simply self-censor rather than discuss issues through, though of critical importance, for fear of getting themselves in trouble. Not one to be intimidated for expressing dissident views, I should say. Kovalek is critical of the efficacy of diversity training and how pandemic downs were implemented. Conservatives tend to be more open-minded based on his experience than liberals. This is a direct quote. The BLM protests initially showed great promise, but ultimately represented a huge lost opportunity. And anarchists are often part of the problem when they individualistically engage in adventurous activities that may endanger the larger movement. He favorably quotes historian Thomas Frank, author of Listen Liberal, quote, "Liberalism has become a politics of upper-class bullying and of character assassination." Kovalek documents how the liberalism of the Democratic Party has drifted into a full-throated support of imperialist war. The promotion of Russiagate by Democrats has captivated liberals for years and won over their hearts and minds to the idea that the CIA and FBI were defenders of democracy and liberty liberty in our country. Anyway, this looks like a really great book. I'm going to go out and get it. Once again, it's called Cancel This Book by Dan Kovalek. I've really liked Dan Kovalek over the years. I mean, he's been involved in many labor struggles that were important. He worked as a lawyer for the United Steelworkers of America, for instance, for many years. So I recommend it. Rainer?
An example of the kind of self-censorship that you say is worth fearing, especially when it comes to social media, is what we've seen in the social media age, where certain malicious actors have weaponized the environment of social media, which creates so much self-consciousness and fear of having vitriol directed against you, and perhaps even losing career opportunities because of the great exposure that social media entails for people, that it's caused some figures to change their public positions on issues in really harmful ways when these malicious actors come after them. What I'm talking about is things like what happened with Sarah Silverman a couple years ago, where Sarah Silverman decried the colonization of Palestine, or something along those lines. I don't remember exactly what it was, but Sarah Silverman decried Israel's human rights abuses in some capacity, and then the Israelis sent their coordinated attackers to come after Sarah Silverman and paint her as an anti-Semite. And then at a certain point, Sarah Silverman caved in and claimed that I've educated myself and I've therefore changed my position, which was really unfortunate. And I don't really see Sarah Silverman as a victim so much in that instance, because you should really stand with what's right, not with what these malicious coordinated actors say is right or wrong. So this is really a moral failure when somebody changes their position from the moral position to the immoral position, when these kinds of actors try to spin the narrative against them. But my point still stands that these actors, they have access to so much power through social media propaganda that they can sway the direction of the public discourse, and they can cause certain people to change their positions on things that can be extremely important, like the issue of settler colonialism and genocide within Palestine.
Yeah. I'm sure that Sarah Silverman must have come under tremendous pressure Number one, she was probably threatened with never getting a job again. You know, that alone, the Zionists pretty much control Hollywood, for example, and that's her bread and butter. That's where she makes her money. She's Jewish herself, so she probably came under a lot of threat from her own community, from her own family, from a lot of others. It is a moral failing, no doubt about it. You are correct. But you know, under those circumstances, most people would probably cave. Unfortunately, most people don't have real strong backbones when it comes to that kind of thing. She's a great comedian, and it would be a shame to see her lose all that she's worked and strived for over many, many decades. Yeah, it's just, it shows the tremendous power that the Zionist cabal has in the world today. Yeah, look what happened with to Corbyn in Great Britain, the immediate past leader of the Labour Party, who probably would have won the election last year if it hadn't been for this, for coming under the tremendous onslaught of the Zionist cabal. Yeah, they have a lot of power. And I mean, Corbyn, you know, he's not, he ended up, I think, not necessarily giving in, but not reacting the way he should have. He didn't really stand up to these people, to these criminals in the Zionist movement. And he still suffered for it. And he's a backbencher today, no longer leading the Labor Party. I'm sure he came under a lot of threats, but I mean, he was a guy who was, you know, an anti-Zionist for decades. He was an anti-war activist for decades. He was a parliamentarian for decades. So not quite the same thing as Sarah Silverman, who this is probably her first ever dealings with anything negative politically. And she caved instantly, it sounds like. It's really quite sad. Next on the list, eternal war and austerity. The hell we're told to accept, by Rainer Shea.
Wars are being continued, both in terms of like the war in Afghanistan, which Biden is not actually ending, but is privatizing, in terms of the war in Yemen, which Biden has actually been worsening despite his promises to end it. And in terms of the proxy wars in Syria and Ukraine that Washington has been orchestrating with the purpose of trying to strategically weaken Russia. As Stephen Lendman observed, I think last week, the dark forces in eastern Ukraine, the forces of imperialism, want perpetual war within Donbass, within Ukraine more broadly, because they want to perpetually try to stave off the rise of the multipolar world in any way they can, like in any capacity, to whatever extent they can. The only way that they can do this is by perpetuating the conflict seemingly forever. I don't know what their end goal is. Perhaps they hope that one day the rise of the multipolar world will be reversed, though, as we've discussed, this is more likely going to result either in a fizzling out of U.S. imperialism or in some unprecedented explosion of violence, like a real World War III scenario, or a repeat of Nazi Germany. But the way that the imperialists are rationalizing this this drive towards world war, towards perpetual war, is by painting Russia and China and the other U.S. adversaries as being perpetually malign actors who are constantly forcing the hand of the imperialists. As I discuss in my article, there's this effort both to paint Russia as a perpetual aggressor in the same vein as it was painted in during the Cold War era, and to paint China as another imperialist power that's forcing the hand of the U.S. empire in terms of human rights. They claim that their sanctions against China, which have been driving down living standards for the Xinjiang Uyghurs, by the way, are simply proportionate responses to China's supposed human rights abuses, but no such human rights abuses are taking place in China, and these sanctions are based in fabricated reasons, like is the case for the proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. The purpose of these sanctions is to try to stave off the rise of a multipolar world by trying to hurt China's interests when it comes to Xinjiang. And something to note there is that Xinjiang, the northwestern part of China, it stands at a crucial node within China's Belt and Road Initiative. So obviously there's going to be a lot of concentrated efforts there to undermine China's interests, whether economically or in terms of information warfare, as they're doing with the Xinjiang genocide propaganda. It really parallels the rationalizations that the Zionists are putting forth for the war crimes against Palestinians, where they've been claiming that all that Israel is doing is responding proportionally to provocations from Hamas. And something to consider there is what I learned today is that under international law, it's legally justified for a colonized, illegally occupied population to respond to their colonization in any fashion that they choose. And Hamas and the Palestinians who elected Hamas to power are responding to their colonization, to their illegal occupation in the fashion that they choose. So the war that Hamas is waging is legitimate. This should be the starting point of all conversations about Hamas and about the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict.
Yes, absolutely. Well said. I don't really have much to add on that one, but I agree with you. The next on the list is the next wave of socialist revolutions is brought closer. Rainer Shea, also Rainer Shea.
In this last year, the imperialists have experienced both one great defeat and one great victory within Latin America. On the one hand, last fall, the indigenous movement in Bolivia forced through an election that resulted in the restoration of power of the Socialist Party in Bolivia, and that ousted the US installed coup regime. So that was a real blow to imperialist power there. But then last month, the imperialists managed to defeat the anti-IMF party at the ballot box by manufacturing a synthetic left that was actually pretty reactionary in nature and that sought purely to delegitimize and undermine the anti-IMF candidate. So in Ecuador, the reactionary trend that the country has been experiencing of austerity and privatization has been reinforced. And also in Colombia, in this last year, the military has been successfully killing hundreds of Marxist-Leninist guerrilla fighters, and it's apparent that by the end of this year, the Colombian government, the fascistic Colombian government, will have attained more territory, which is pretty unfortunate. But it's also endemic of the objective, hard, pragmatic material assessment that was made a couple of years ago about the nature of the revolutionary struggle in Latin America. This is that the struggle for the liberation of Latin America from imperialism is going to be discontinuous and not always successful. I'm referring to the prediction from this Indian Marxist named Saikat Buttarachara. I'm pretty sure I'm not pronouncing his last name right, but I like his work. I like his predictions because they're both optimistic and they make pragmatic observations like these. He's observed that due to the financial economic hegemony that the imperialists continue to hold over Latin America and over the neo-colonies around the globe in general, there's going to be a lot of patchy victories in the anti-imperialist struggle, at least until a larger economic collapse of US imperialism occurs, which might come pretty soon with the collapse of the dollar. At that point, the US is going to lose the financial tools, the productive forces, the economic hegemony, economic leverage that it's so long been able to use to keep the neo-colonies under the fold. At that point, all that they'll be able to resort to is paramilitarism and desperate acts of ethnic cleansing, class warfare, military buildup. They won't any longer have the economic stranglehold that they once held. All that they'll be able to rely on is terror and shoddy authoritarian regimes that they've propped up and have installed through coups like the one in Honduras. There's going to be a lot of destabilization in the coming years throughout these neo-colonies and in the imperial core that causes there to be a great opening for the revolutionary struggle. And it's in this environment of instability, of the economic weakening of the global bourgeoisie, that the new wave of socialist revolutions that my Indian Marxist friend predicts will emerge within.
Definitely. This has always been a process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We suffer defeats. We suffer we enjoy victories. That's the way of the world. We have a lot of determined working class people in the world, a lot of Marxist-Leninists, revolutionary socialist people, but there are also a lot of enemies. And we've seen the nasty, dirty tricks that they are up to. We have seen what they're into. So, yeah, it's not a straightforward thing, anywhere near as straightforward as we would hope for it to be. So, next on our list, pictures of a Ukrainian dream. This is an article by Pablo Escobar in the Greanville Post at thegreenvillepost.com, and that's GREANVILLE post.com. It appeared on May 11th, and it was referring to a meeting last Thursday, a week ago, between the Ukrainian president, Zelensky. You'll recall from discussions we've had of him in the past, he used to be a comedian in Actually, Escobar calls him the comedian in chief. But Zelensky was a comedian in Ukraine, very popular. He was on the most popular television show where he played the president of Ukraine. And then he ran for president and became president. And now he's president. And he's been a backboneless person who's pushed around by both sides a lot. Anyway, the American Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken of Winkin, Blinken, and Nod fame, was there last Thursday meeting with Zelensky, mainly talking about the problems between Russia and Ukraine, as both sides have weapons pointed at one another. Russia has backed off the border with a lot of its build up there. Basically, they had said they were doing exercises, military exercises, and they said they're finished now and they've withdrawn. However, they can be there in a moment's notice. Russia is on the border with Ukraine. So, according to Escobar, Ukrainian President Zelensky was read a no holds barred riot act by the American Secretary of State. Escobar says, here are the guidelines. And he's talking here about a leaked plan that came out of this meeting. The American plan, basically, that was delivered by Blinken for Ukraine. And this exposes quite a lot of what, if you read the articles about this event in the bourgeois press, you'll hear none of this. What you'll hear is how Blinken was there to support Zelensky and support Ukraine against the evil Russians and blah, blah, blah. But underneath it all, in this leaked plan, this secret plan, here are the guidelines according to Pablo Escobar, one of my favorite journalists, by the way. He says, all Ukrainian state corporations must be controlled by the proverbial foreign interests. So broad majorities must be either foreign or fifth columnists. Of course, fifth columnist meaning that there's someone in Ukraine who works for a foreign interest. And of course, the foreign interests are European, EU, basically, and American. The entire anti-corporation corruption vertical drive must also be foreign controlled. Same for the judicial system. Andrei Kovalyev, an American asset, must be reinstated as head of Naftogaz. Zelensky moved mountains to get rid of Kovalyev just a little while back because he was such a corrupt figure, but he was also an American asset. So Zelensky's been told by Blinken he must reinstate Kovalyev. Blinken demanded a massive push against every Ukrainian oligarch so that huge chunks of the Ukrainian economy are transferred to who else? Foreigners. Same for land privatization. Somewhat hilariously, Blinken warned that Russian troops might invade Ukraine. In this case, Zelensky can count only on huge political assistance, not military assistance. So Zelensky, in fact, was ordered to stop asking to join NATO and cease provoking Russia, as President Putin, who already drew red lines, you remember the red lines we talked about a few weeks ago, could make a a drastic, quote unquote, drastic decision. Blinken demanded that American assets should be untouchable by Ukrainian law and named honored figures in civil society. Maidan cookie distributor, this is a joke about because she was at the Maidan demonstrations distributing cookies. Victoria, fuck the EU Newland. That's Victoria Newland, who's a Democrat, a very far right-wing pro-imperialist Democrat who apparently is working for Biden now. She was working for Trump. Anyway, Victoria Newland also was in the room and drew up a list of untouchables. The Blinken and Blinken met with them separately. So apparently Blinken took Victoria fuck the EU Newland along with him as his advisor because she's very well familiar with Ukraine, having been one of the engineers of the Ukrainian fascist coup d'etat installed by Obama during the Obama regime. She's been in government for a while. Her husband's also pretty well known in State Department. Finally, the giant ghost hanging over the whole trip to Kiev had to make itself known. In practice, Zelensky was invited to turn in everyone in Ukraine who helped bring information about Hunter Biden to the media via Rudolph Giuliani. So in other words, Zelensky's been told now that he's got to name names to Giuliani of everyone who was involved in exposing Hunter Biden's crimes. And of course, we know Hunter Biden is the pampered, useless son of the president right now, the American dictator, pedophile Joe Biden, as I call him. So anyway, people hopefully will remember that brouhaha last year when all these crimes that Hunter Biden had been involved with in Ukraine were exposed by the Ukrainian media and by prominent Ukrainian parliamentarians and politicians. So there you have it. Pretty interesting, huh?
Yeah, I'm gonna read a part from an article by was it? I don't remember who wrote it, but it was called "How and Why the U.S. Government Perpetrated the Coup in Ukraine." That's pretty much verbatim its title. Please look it up. Yeah. It says, clearly, Victoria Newland, U.S. President Barack Obama's central agent overseeing the coup, at least during the month of February 2014 when it climaxed, was crucial not only in overthrowing the existing Ukrainian government, but in selecting and installing its rapidly anti-Russian replacement. The 27 January 2014 phone conversation between Newland and America's ambassador in Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, was a particularly seminal event, and it was uploaded to YouTube on 4 February 2014. I have discussed elsewhere that call and its significance. Newland there and then abandoned the EU's hope for a still democratic but less corrupt future government for Ukraine, and Newland famously said on that call, "Fuck the EU," and Newland instructed Pyatt to choose instead the rabidly anti-Russian and far-right Arseniy Yatsenyuk. So that's the context behind this quote that he keeps referencing. It sounds like the U.S. deliberately chose the least democratic option for a succeeding government within Ukraine. And then I think it was in 2019, this new comedian president was elected. despite the damage to democracy that had just been done. And even though there was a vague mimicry of a democracy within this system, within this political system in Ukraine that is presented to us as a good and righteous model of governance so absurdly, there's clearly still a dominance of the Nazistic strains that became dominant within Ukraine following the 2014 US orchestrated coup. From what I've heard, this comedian guy is basically a neoconservative cutout who takes the neutral position within this fascistic government that he's navigating, and he's definitely complicit in the proliferation of the neo-Nazi militias that have been carrying out ethnic cleansing and political paramilitary targeting and persecution of the LGBT community within Ukraine. And when I say ethnic cleansing, I mean not just against Romas, not just against Jews, but against the 1/3 of the Ukrainian population that's Russian speaking, and that this fascist US installed government desperately seeks to erase as a cultural facet of Ukraine so that they can permanently rewrite Ukraine's political DNA for the purposes of acclimating it to endless anti-Russian proxy war.
Yeah. The upshot of this article by Pablo Escobar is that the Americans are getting ready to just rape, pillage Ukraine, pillage everything out of Ukraine that's worth stealing, and get while the getting's going, because they can already see that Ukraine is already a failed state. And so it's not looking good for Ukraine in the short term. We should point out that even though Zelensky came to power on this, or came to run the government on this platform of getting rid of corruption, most of his anti-corruption efforts, you can see what happened with this guy at the big gas company that ran the big gas company. He finally got rid of him, and now Blinken's telling him you got to bring him back because he's an American asset. And that's what's happened pretty much all the way along. And Zelensky's pretty backboneless and been pushed into doing exactly what the fascists want. It might appear that Ukraine is no longer as fascist as it was to begin with, and after the bloody American-sponsored, American-directed coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. However, when you look at who's really controlling the security, the police and army, military wings of the Ukrainian state, it's still the same fascist forces from the same fascist political parties that we've seen in power essentially since the Maidan protests put them in power. So not much has changed there. And things are looking pretty dire in Ukraine right now. Ukraine is considered the basket case of Europe right now. Its economy is so down in the dumpster. Nothing works in the economy. Massive unemployment, massive suffering. Ukraine continues to lob shells and missiles in on Russian-speaking neighborhoods in the eastern part of the country. Most of those neighborhoods are now abandoned because more than 1.5 million refugees have left that area to go to Russia. They've gone to several other countries as well as refugees. So the only people that are left are the Russian Ukrainian militias that are defending that area against these fascist political parties, these fascist forces, and the Ukrainian military, which is also fascist, essentially. Not everybody in the Ukrainian military is fascist, but all of its leadership is fascist. Next on the list and final is Colombia's massacres will one day be replicated in the U.S.
Oh, isn't this an extension of what we were just talking about? About how the Nazis have taken over Ukraine's military and have been carrying out these genocidal goals.
Yeah.
It turns out that behind these atrocities we're seeing in Colombia is a pretty darn strong influence among neo-Nazis within Colombia's military. This one Nazi who is a former leader of a disbanded fascist party within Colombia. When I say fascist, I mean they really love to rock the swastika flag. This mission to suppress class struggle comes from the designs of this Nazi figure, who I mentioned in my article, who says that Colombia's military is unprepared to sufficiently counter a hypothetical class uprising, and it needs to preemptively wage war against the population so that it can prevent the manifestation of proletarian revolution within Colombia. This is how far ahead fascists tend to think. They're the fighting wing of the capitalist class, so their priority is always first to crush the class struggle by any means necessary. This guy is so obsessed with fighting, with crushing class struggle, that he is helping persuade the military and all of its adjacent arms of the capitalist state to violently crush these protests that largely don't seem to be connected directly with an effort to carry out proletarian revolution. I mean, the actual Marxist-Leninist guerrillas within Colombia are pretty marginal. They've been losing hundreds of members in this last year to targeted government attacks. But nonetheless, this paranoia of the prospect of revolution among this influential fascist is very prevalent, and he's reacting to this fear of his by egging on the government to kill as many random protesters as possible. There have been, I don't know exactly what the number is so far of protesters who have been killed, but last I heard it was several dozen, and the police have been coordinating with the military and with paramilitaries to start massacring people after 7 p.m. every night. There have also been operations to track down protest leaders via GPS and either execute them on the spot or arrest them, even though Colombia's constitution is supposed to protect the right to protest. Already they've totally thrown out these rights that they've given their people in favor of dictatorial terror, which, when you pay attention to the direction of class struggle in the United States, is clearly going to be replicated in the coming decades where we live. It seems like the only difference between the levels of state violence within Colombia and the levels of state violence within the US is the amount of people who the police in the U.S. feel comfortable with killing. I mean protesters specifically, relative to the amount of protesters that the police in Colombia feel comfortable with killing. From what I can tell, one of the more notable instances of somebody getting killed in the U.S. by police at a protest has been when this one guy brought a gun to a protest and he laid it down and tried to run away, and they shot him despite him clearly being unarmed, which was obviously an injustice, but it was a more extreme instance, like relatively. What I mean to say is the U.S. U.S. police haven't been orchestrating the exact kinds of massacres that the Colombian police have been carrying out. The closest thing that I can think of to it is the Kent State massacre, where several people were killed, and even that wasn't quite as numerous as the massacres that we're seeing in Colombia right now. So it's clear that within the neo-colonies, the levels of state violence are for now more pronounced than in the United States, but that's going to change in the coming decades as class struggle in the U.S. intensifies.
Yes, yes. That's a heavy note upon which to end the show. It's certainly, as we've emphasized throughout this episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review, we face a lot of ominous terror, basically, from fascist elements. And the fascist elements, as we've noted for several years now, are on the rise in the world, in several places in the world. They do have more power, and they seem to be totally supported by the American regime, the current American regime, the past, certainly the past regime, the Trump, the Biden now. And we, the working class, we really need to step up our game to start organizing ourselves to fight back against this, because it is against us. The same kinds of people as you and me here in America are the victims of these massacres going on in the last several weeks in Colombia. Yeah, it's a heavy note upon which to end. However, it is something that we really need to look square in the face and respond to. So with that, Rainer, thank you so much as always. Many fine contributions from you tonight. Yeoman's job at being a prolific writer, as you always are. Keep them coming, everybody. There will be links to the articles that Rainer mentioned in the show this evening, posted below this video. And thanks especially to all our loyal viewers. Thanks for listening in, for tuning in. Thanks for coming back. And we look forward to presenting you with another issue of Revolutionary Socialist Review next week. So long, Rainer.